Rockefeller's foundation, the General Education Board, $3.1 million to John Dewey. He hires a guy to run it called Frederick Gates. And thankfully, Frederick Gates also left a lot of primary source material for us to dig through about what he believed. And you can read what he had to say. In our vision, he says, these people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. And he specifically says, we don't need philosophers and writers and lawyers and preachers and scientists. We need workers. That's what we need to produce here. So it's a very bizarre story, but I think the evidence is overwhelming that the plan was to deliberately dumb down the population.
Well, hello, moms, dads, and grands, and welcome back to M for All Academy. If you're new here, we like to say this is the school for parents, grandparents, and friends committed to defending and preserving liberty with a special focus on topics and issues that impact kids, schools, and of course, parental rights. Today, we're joined by Alex Newman to talk about one of the most important and often overlooked issues in America, parental rights. The question is, who is actually responsible for raising the next generation? Now, on paper, it might seem pretty obvious, but in practice, parents are facing pressure from schools, bureaucracies, cultural institutions, and a growing mindset that treats children a whole lot less like a family member and a whole lot more like public property. As a mom, I'm not okay with that. It goes much deeper than curriculum, opt-outs, or classroom policies, too. The real question is whether parents still have the responsibility and the right to shape their children's education, worldview, and moral upbringing, because that role is increasingly being claimed by state, schools, and other institutions in the culture. Alex has spent years connecting the dots between education, government overreach, and the larger fight for liberty. We'll explore why the family is so central to a free society, how we got here, what parents are up against now, and what they can do moving forward. Welcome back to class. Welcome to the program, Alex. I am so excited for this conversation.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Missy.
So I'm a big fan of yours. Actually, all of our Moms for Liberty people are big fans. We've had you at numerous events, and I'm particularly excited to get to talk to you about this because I think you do a great job of summarizing so many of these topics. And so today, what we're talking about, of course, is just kind of like overall parental rights and understanding why are they so important to a free society. So can you help unpack that a little bit, like lay the groundwork? What are they and why are they important in a free society?
Well, they are absolutely essential to a free society. And thank you for those kind words, Missy. As you know, I'm a huge fan of Moms for Liberty. I love what you guys do. And I'm so grateful for all of the incredibly important work you're doing to protect parental rights and to protect our children from this massive government overreach. And I just want to start with the obvious fact here. And I wish people would talk about this more. There is nobody in the entire world who loves a child more than his or her parents. There's no way of substituting that. Yeah, grandparents love the kids. Yeah, aunts and uncles love the kids. Yeah, the neighbors love the kids. But bureaucrats, but ultimately, mom and dad are the people who are most invested in those children. So parental rights, if we're going to define it, you might even call it parental responsibilities and rights. Parents have an obligation, a duty, and the right to direct the upbringing of their children. And of course, that does not include being abusive. It doesn't include hurting the child, but it includes deciding what kind of education the child is going to receive. It includes determining whether and how that child is going to be involved in religious activities. It includes all of the critical decisions that are going to be made for that child up until the age of adulthood, which, in the United States, for most of us is 18. Sometimes kids, mature a little earlier, sometimes, 26, 27. But the important point to mention here is parents need to be the ones in charge of making these decisions, not bureaucrats, not other people, with the very, very rare exception for that 1 in a million case where parents are for some reason incapable, whether it's, drug addiction or some sort of personality abusive issue. But for the most part, we want parents to be in charge of the upbringing of their children. Nobody cares more. Nobody's more invested. And nobody else is going to be able to do a better job. We have this crazy idea in society that if you have enough letters after your name, if you got enough degrees and doctorates, you're going to be better at helping that child grow into a mature adult than mom or dad. And it's simply not true, because love is the key ingredient, and nobody's going to be able to provide that like mom and dad. And therefore, nobody's is more invested in making good decisions for that child than mom and dad. And our court system has recognized that. Our legal tradition has recognized that for centuries. And that's been the norm throughout the human experience. It's a very new phenomenon that we have government trying to intrude on something that, for all of human history and virtually every human society, has been understood to be within the domain of family and parents.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's amazing that we are living in this state, especially you see things now, like I think was it Vermont or New Hampshire that just passed the bill to that parents have to basically prove that they're not going to harm their own kids in order to be able to homeschool, which is bananas,
Yeah.
absolutely bananas to me. That it really truly is mind blowing. So, do you think that Americans really truly understand that it is so important for the family, the nuclear family, which is under attack, is truly tied to the survival of America, like the self government and freedom society that we have?
Unfortunately, I don't think there's a broad and wide enough understanding of this issue. And I think that's deliberate. I think for a period of generations now, there's been a concerted effort to try to undermine the family unit, to try to undermine the role of parents. And if you go back far enough, you'll find revolutionaries, I would argue evil revolutionaries, openly expressing their view on the importance of undermining the family unit. Not for the purpose of making things better for the children, but for the purpose of fundamentally transforming society. Marx, for example, Karl Marx, a very, very vicious advocate of having the government come in and take over a lot of the parental responsibilities typically associated with family. He believed that that marriage was a bourgeois institution that perpetuated the oppression of capitalism and the system. And so they were very open about their desire to undermine that relationship. You look just a few generations after Karl Marx, some of his little disciples, like Wilhelm Reich, these people openly said, we have to smash the family because then we can get a hold of the children. Right now, parents are the primary influence on their children, and they're passing along their faith and their values and their culture and their traditions to the next generation. Unless we can sever that link, we're never going to be able to have our wonderful little revolution where we're going to create utopia with no private property, no family, no God, no church, etc. So they understood that this was a strategic issue. It wasn't an end in and of itself, it was a means to an end. And they've been very successful now in propagating these ideas. I think parents intuitively understand. I mean, they don't need to be taught. They intuitively understand that they are the ones who will make the best decisions for their children. And so parents generally are protective of that. But the bonds have been weakening now for so long. If you look like back in the 1970s, when divorce started becoming very, very common, you look now at the American family, it really has been disintegrating for generations, and it's been getting worse. And so, along with that, now we've got a huge contingent of children who were either raised by a single parent, or in some cases raised by no parents, raised by grandma, raised by grandpa, and they have been filled with ideas that come from the very revolutionaries that I was just talking about, where they've been trained to believe that parents might even be a danger to their children. Right? You mentioned the bill in Connecticut; it's a perfect encapsulation of this kind of thinking. You have to apply to the Department of Child Welfare, the Child Protective Services, they call it in some states, for permission to educate your own children. Now, this was a piece of legislation that was voted on by the elected representatives of the people of Kentucky. So they may not perfectly represent the views of their constituents, but the fact that elected representatives who are going to have to go home and face voters thought they could get away with saying that parents need to ask permission from the government to be able to educate their own children tells you that that concept, that understanding of the importance of parental rights and really parental duties and responsibilities has been eroded in a massive way. And I would argue in a very dangerous way that represents now an existential threat to the continued survival of freedom and our republic.
And you mentioned something earlier, which I think is very true. We have bought this lie somehow. It's ironic because the concept of experts. So you got to trust the experts, because on the one hand, you hear a big message. I hear a message everywhere being said, we don't have to go to college. You don't need a college degree to be successful, which is arguably true to a point, depending on the career that you want to go into. But at the same time, people always tend to look at someone with the letters after their name invariably as the true expert and someone who must know more than me, even though in reality, it is entirely possible that they don't. And it has shifted, I think, a lot of our parents' trust in themselves, which is ironic because you also said this, that parents intuitively do get it. They know that we should be the ones raising our own kids, yet somehow we outsource this. And it is surprising to me. And I think it's interesting because then where of course is the first place that, or maybe the biggest place of attack, seems to be the schools, which makes sense because in the Bible it says, raise up your child in the way, and then when he is older, he will not depart from it. And so that kind of talks about school, sort of, to a certain degree. And we see that, of course, with many other not so great folks, historical leaders that have recognized that as well. And I don't want to quote anybody because we've had that work to use against us in the past.
What a bunch of clowns, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm not going to say anything there, but we all know that is a thing, that this is something that's well known. So can you talk a little bit about the history of public education? Because I think people forget, or frankly, probably don't even realize just how Marxist the origin of it is and where our public education in America actually came from.
Yeah, I'm so glad we get to talk about this because I really think it's one of the most important untold historical narratives that has caused our society to go so far off track. So I first read about the first guy to think that government ought to educate our children. I saw just like a little footnote about him in a book by my friend and late colleague, Dr. Samuel Blumenfeld. I co-wrote Crimes of the Educators with him back in 2013. And he had mentioned Robert Owen in a few places, but didn't get deep into it. So I saw that and I said, well, I got to know more about this guy, Robert Owen. So I started looking into him, and what I found was appalling. So this, for the folks who don't know Robert Owen, you should. He was a very, very prominent individual. He was a wealthy individual. And in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, he came up with all these grandiose ideas about social reform. In his words, he claimed to be fighting what he described as the trinity of the most monstrous evils. Okay. And this trinity of the most monstrous evils, he said, was family and marriage. That was one of the elements of this trinity. Private property, which of course is the foundation of a free society. God said, "Thou shalt not steal." Right? This has been even cavemen in the jungle recognize, like, "Hey, I built this hut. This is my hut. Get out of my hut." And then, last but not least, what he called irrational religion, and in particular, he was taking aim at Christianity, Judaism, kind of the traditional bedrock values and beliefs that built Western civilization. So that was his goal in life, fighting this great trinity of the most monstrous evils. Very influential. There was actually little Owenite societies all over America where his little acolytes and disciples would get together and talk about his ideas and how great they were. So long story short, he married into a very wealthy textile family in Wales, moved to the United States, actually set up a communist commune in Indiana called New Harmony, where he wanted to test his ideas, right? No families, no marriage. He said women could be held in common, and couples could just cohabitate, and if any children were born, they would be raised by the collective. No private property, so of course no incentive to do anything. And surprise, very much like Cuba, the Soviet Union, Vietnam, you name your communist utopia, it failed very quickly. Starvation, all those things, shortages, immediately the order of the day. So he concluded the real problem here was that these people in his little commune were too selfish because they had been raised in a society that was very Christian, that was very selfish. They're worried about their individual rights and their property and things like this. So his solution, and he wrote about this extensively in a series of essays, including a new view of society, things like this. And he argued that the solution was to have the government take over the education of children. And he had already started experimenting with some of this stuff. He owned textile manufacturing facilities. And so he was having people come in and hand their children over to like maybe you might call it a proto daycare center, where they were trying to convince these kids that collectivism was the way to go and things like this. So he writes all these things on paper, and you can imagine Americans weren't thrilled with the idea. Like, we're doing a fine job raising our children. Thank you. We don't need help from the government. Maybe if you could show us a chapter and verse in the Bible, we'll think about it. But of course, there is no such verse. So they weren't interested. But something really interesting happened. A guy, and he talks about this in his autobiography, which I have, this Baron Jacobi. He was a minister and ambassador for the dictator of Prussia, Frederick William III, who was still smarting from losing a war with Napoleon. He was like, what did I do wrong? Why aren't my soldiers effective in stopping the invasion? So Baron Jacobi takes these essays from Robert Owen back to the dictator of Prussia. And Robert Owen says the dictator of Prussia so much approved of his ideas that he ordered his interior ministry to really create what would become the first ever system of education of the state, by the state, and for the state. He actually summons other European rulers and tells them, hey, guys, I had this great idea that I got. Why don't we have the government take over the education of children? They're like, no, that's crazy. But so that's how that system originally took root in Prussia. Now, how did it come back to the United States? Well, that's a very interesting story in and of itself. Before we get to the man who brought it from Prussia back to the United States, a little detour. Robert Owen, according to a whistleblower, his name was Orsis Brownson. He was part of Robert Owen's little movement, eventually became a Roman Catholic and defected from his involvement and blew the whistle. He says that Robert Owen had launched a secret society in America. And he gives a very detailed explanation of this. I encourage people to read what he had to say. It's mind-blowing. So he says this secret society was active across the states, and it was working toward, he says, getting public opinion to shift in favor of having the government play at least some role in education, and of getting men elected to legislatures who would support the idea of having the government take over this realm, the education realm. And Orsis Brownson says, I knew of this because I was organizing the state of New York. So, I had firsthand knowledge of what we were doing. He says he doesn't quite know what was all going on in the other states, but he knows about New York. And he says, in his exact words, I'm quoting from memory, so I might get a word or two wrong, but he says the great object was to get rid of Christianity. It's like, we didn't say that openly. We didn't want people to get all mad, but of course we would belabor the clergy where we could. And he said, eventually we wanted a national system of education where all religion would be excluded, where only knowledge verifiable by the census could be taught. And we were going to force parents, he says, we were going to compel them by law to send their children. So that was going on in the background. And, by nature, it's very difficult to track secret societies, of course. And before we get to how the system came from Prussia back to the United States, I'll have one more thing to add here. And I only recently discovered this. The first time I published it is in a recent book that I just wrote with Robert Bortons, a friend of mine. He's the CEO of Classical Conversations. It's called Woke and Weaponized, How Karl Marx took control of American education and how we can take it back. So it's the first time we've revealed this. But Robert Owen, just a few months before he died, convened what he called the Congress of the Advanced Minds of the World. Very humble people. And he invited all these advanced minds, and he revealed to these people that he was getting his ideas. And again, fact check me on this. Go verify yourself. Don't take my word for it. Go fact check me on this. Go read his speech at the Congress. He says he's getting his ideas from spirits that he's talking to. And he explains who these spirits are or who he thinks they are. He explains how he's communicating with them. He says they talk to him through Ouija boards and they tap on walls and furniture. He says they have superior intelligence and they're preparing humanity for a glorious new age where apparently we won't have family, we won't have religion, and we won't have private property. So fascinating, fascinating revelation. Now, we'll summarize very quickly. This system took root in Prussia, as I mentioned, and then Horace Mann. So I can't directly connect him yet to the little secret society that Robert Owen started, although I suspect there's a connection. He gets himself selected by the Massachusetts legislature as the first ever Secretary of Education for any state. No state had ever had a Secretary of Education because no state had ever gotten involved in education beyond just, make sure the kids can read so they can read their Bible. So he becomes Secretary of Education, and he tells people the Prussian system is brilliant. We need to import it into Massachusetts. So he sets that as his mission. He studies the Prussian system. He actually goes to Prussia to study the Prussian system. And I want to be fair. In his defense, he does say, the Prussian dictatorship is a dictatorship. And, they're using this system for nefarious purposes. They're brainwashing these kids to be good little obedient worker drones and slaves. But he says, hey, we're a free, self-governing republic. So if they can use that for bad purposes, imagine how great we could do if we used it for good purposes. So he sets the system in motion in Massachusetts. When he's done in Massachusetts, he hits the road. He goes to Connecticut. He goes to New York. He goes to New Jersey. He tells all these legislatures the glories of government education. And that's what sets the ball in motion when government took over the education of children from family and from the church.
Wow. This is so genuinely, it like makes me pause because when I first started researching all of this, I think the thing I struggled with the most, that I imagine probably other parents, I'm hoping I'm not the only one who struggled with this, is it's such a difference in worldview of what is right and wrong, of what is good and bad. The concept of not wanting to support the family alone is just so shocking. It's genuinely hard to wrap your head around the fact that anyone would think this is a good idea. It was for me anyway. Yeah. That's incredible. And I think it's such an important story that people don't realize. So many times we're accused of being conspiracy theorists, but I got to be like, well, it's not really a conspiracy if they write it down.
That's right.
What their plans are.
Yeah.
But so how did early education reformers understand that? What did they get about shaping children that apparently parents don't seem to realize today?
Well, and even Robert Owen wrote about this. He argued that if we want to have adults who will be capable of living in this glorious new society with no private property, no family, and no religion, we have to get them while they're young. And I think early Americans had a good sense of that because they read their Bible, right? Over and over again, the Bible talks about this. I mean, you quoted Proverbs 22:6, where you train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. That message is echoed throughout the scriptures. I mean, you read in Deuteronomy, parents training their children and how that works. You read in Psalm 78, the cataclysm that results when that process doesn't take place, when parents forget to pass on the knowledge and the values to their children. So early Americans understood this pretty well. But what happened was the reformers were very nefarious in how they got this through. So they didn't openly talk about like, hey, we're going to brainwash all your kids so that they have radically new views so we can create a utopia. It was more like, oh, we just want the children just a little bit, just so they can learn some basics. And, Horace Mann, he didn't directly attack religion, but he said, well, we'll just, focus more on academic subjects, the 3 R's, and we'll leave Bible for Sunday school because we don't want to get into discussions about the doctrine of predestination. Presbyterians believe something very different from the Baptists on baptism. So why don't we just leave all that for Sunday school and we'll just focus on the secular stuff? So we had this divide. And honestly, there was a lot of resistance to this early on. There's actually credible reports that in Massachusetts, they had to call out the militia in some communities to force parents to hand over their children. After in 1852, they made it compulsory to send your children for at least a little while. So there was a lot of resistance early on. But these reformers, these people, whether you're looking at Robert Owen, whether you're looking at Horace Mann, he had some startling quotes that are easy to verify. Like, we're entitled to look upon parents as having given hostages to our cause. Like, wait, what? We didn't agree to give you hostages. So this is the kind of stuff they talked about. You look at John Dewey's writings. I mean, I've got dozens of this guy's books, and just astounding the understanding that they had about how profound they would be able to shape the minds and the hearts of these children if they could get them in a classroom for 5 days a week for 6, 8, 9 months out of the year. So they understood very clearly. Karl Marx understood very clearly. Karl Marx's disciples understood very clearly. Adolf Hitler understood very clearly, and he wrote about it. Joseph Stalin, Vladimir Lenin, Fidel Castro, they all understood that what the Bible teaches in Proverbs 22:6, there's a really strong element of truth there. If we can get these children from the time they're young and teach them that their parents are rubes, their parents are backwards, their parents are climate criminals, their parents are irredeemable racists, or they voted for Trump, therefore they're fascists. If we can discredit the parents, if we can pry these children away from the protecting influence of their parents, we can shape them, and then we can accomplish whatever we want. And so they've written on this so extensively. And today they don't even hide it anymore. I mean, you see President Biden repeatedly getting up to the podium and saying, they're not their children, they're our children, right? So they don't even hide it anymore, but they all understand if we can shape the hearts and minds of the children, we own the future. And that's one of the reasons why this trend is so incredibly dangerous.
So I think it's fair to say then public school pretty much really started as a tool for literacy and basic civic formation. Like like you said, teaching some of just the basic stuff, which I think pretty much everyone can get behind. And it has since evolved into something obviously far more intrusive. So modern days, the education system is clearly failing. I mean, if we look at our academic scores, and kids, we're not doing so well. That's for sure. The argument is that it's always underfunded. So what would you say? Is it actually underfunded, or is there an underlying philosophy that's broken, which I might say, or is it perhaps that this is actually the goal of the overall process, a long-term goal perhaps, or what are we looking at? What's the reason here?
Well, we can start with this issue of underfunding. The idea that the government school system is underfunded is about the most preposterous thing I ever heard in my life. And the idea that throwing more taxpayer money at this is somehow going to improve things is so easy to discredit. It's hard to imagine that people could seriously, with a straight face, say, we need more money. Chicago, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Detroit. I mean, you look at these jurisdictions, they spend more money per child than virtually any other place in the country. They've got multiple schools that can't produce one single student who, on the government's own dumbed down tests, reaches basic proficiency in any core subject, right? And we're spending $25, sometimes $30,000 on every one of these victims. I mean, children, sorry, in this system. If money was going to produce good education, the children in Chicago, the children in Detroit, the children in Baltimore would be by far the best educated children in the country. And the children in Utah, children in Oklahoma, children in Florida would be dolts. In fact, what we see is actually the opposite. So clearly, money is not the issue. More money will just give them more fancy tools, more career development and professional development opportunities to learn these tools better, to dumb down and hurt your children. So this is where it gets controversial. And I think a lot of people, the reigning paradigm is that it's just something went wrong. We just have to tinker with the policy a little bit and then we can improve it. The reality is, I think this was deliberate from the beginning. And I think the evidence for that is overwhelming. And I know that's super controversial to say, and I know people are getting mad at me right now. I'm not talking about your Aunt Sally, who I know is a wonderful lady and, teaches the kindergarten, just loves the kid. And I know all that. But if you look at how this system developed, you'll find at every step of the way, people who I think in very clear language were talking about the deliberate dumbing down of children. My friend Charlotte Iserby, who was a senior advisor to Ronald Reagan on education policy, and God rest her soul, she passed away a few years ago, but she became a very dear friend of mine before she passed away. She actually wrote a whole book called The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. And when she got to the Department of Education under Ronald Reagan, she got the smoking gun documents proving that this is what they were doing, that they were merging our education system with the Soviet Union, that they were deliberately dumbing down our kids. And she started leaking them to publications like Human Events, and it caused a scandal at that time. People have forgotten it, but the evidence is overwhelming. So let's go back to John Dewey, who is very often considered to be the founding father of America's public school system. And I think, in fairness, some of that blame needs to go to Horace Mann and Robert Owen, but John Dewey is often where people start. And if you read John Dewey's own writings, for me, it's crystal clear that he wanted to dumb down the population. So let me give you one very clear example. I would encourage people to read this essay. It's actually so important that we reprinted it as an appendix in the book I mentioned earlier, Crimes of the Educators. Phyllis Schlafly, when she endorsed our book, was just astounded that the record was so clear. So in this essay, and he spells fetish differently than we would, but he argues that Americans have this fetish with primary education, that we have to teach children how to read and do math and how to think critically and how to use logic and how to approach a text and analyze it and comprehend it. He said, we don't need to do that stuff, especially not when they're little. He said the real focus needs to be on bringing into their minds a collectivist value system. He argues that they need to understand, your individuality. That's all fine and great, but that's not what's important. What really matters is the collective. It's the group, and that's what need to be focused on. The other stuff he says we can maybe think about later. And so this, as far as I'm concerned, is smoking gun evidence that he fully intended to dumb down the population. Now, it gets even worse. Okay, this guy, John Dewey, and anybody who's got a degree in education will know exactly who I'm talking about. They probably haven't read his books directly, but I would encourage you to do it because the smoking gun evidence is all in there. He teams up with John D. Rockefeller. Okay. Now, and this is a weird story because John Dewey is an actual communist in the truest sense of the term. I mean, this guy goes to the Soviet Union to study their system and You can read his essays. They were published in an American magazine, New Republic, and you can read this guy just practically worshipped the Soviet Union. No mention of the mass murder, no mention of the torture, the gulag, only how great the system was and how the children were being collectivized and how they were having a collectivistic mentality instilled in them. So he loves this Soviet communist totalitarian system. And he partners with the richest capitalist in the world at that time, John D. Rockefeller. And that doesn't make sense to people. It's like cognitive dissonance. Why would a communist team up with a capitalist to build an education system? Well, John D. Rockefeller creates a huge philanthropic organization called the General Education Board right around the turn of the century, right around the year 1900, and starts pumping millions of dollars, which back then was unfathomable amounts of money. And he brings John Dewey under his wing, and he actually funds an experimental school for John Dewey at the University of Chicago. And so this school goes on for years, and they graduate a bunch of kids. And turns out they can't read, they can't write, they can't do math, they can't tell right from wrong. It's astounding how bad it is. And what's really fascinating? Rockefeller sent one of his children there, and his child ended up illiterate. For him it was okay because he had a secretary, so he could get by with that handicap. But most of us can't afford secretaries, so it's a lot more difficult for us. So they knew what this was going to do. And yet they said, hey, let's do this nationwide. Interesting. So Rockefeller's Foundation, the General Education Board, $3.1 million to John Dewey. He hires a guy to run it called Frederick Gates. And thankfully, Frederick Gates also left a lot of primary source material for us to dig through about what he believed. And you can read what he had to say. In our vision, he says, these people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. And he specifically says, we don't need philosophers and writers and lawyers and preachers and scientists. We need workers. That's what we need to produce here. So it's a very bizarre story, but I think the evidence is overwhelming that the plan was to deliberately dumb down the population. They understood that a population that can't read its Bible, can't read its Constitution, doesn't know the first thing about its history, is much easier to transform, and I would argue ultimately enslave, than a well-educated, highly literate population that's bitterly clinging to their guns and their Bibles. That's hard to enslave. So I think the evidence is over, and I could keep going, Missy, but I think I've provided enough leads for people to track this down on their own and see for themselves that what I'm saying is correct.
I really appreciate you highlighting so many specifics, because that's part of what I found. I actually discovered a lot of this more when I was researching last year. We covered comprehensive sexuality education, and it was truly shocking to me when I read about Rockefeller's involvement in education, and they explicitly state that, and that they just want more workers, not to mention some other research I've done. And it was so surprising, because parents don't get this. So I guess what I'd love to understand, because I actually agree with you. I do believe that this was very intentional based on what seems pretty obvious, because they basically say it. So given that, I think that many teachers, I agree with you there as well. I'm not talking about everyone. I think, unfortunately, we're looking at lots of people who have very good intentions and end up becoming useful idiots because they're sold on the emotional aspect. And so right now, schools have shifted into, in today's world, it's a lot more of managing kids, right, than educating them, and all of these ideologies that are taught and pushed. But they're pushed in terms that sound, or using language, I should say, that just sounds so good. So social emotional learning, of course, which you have talked about with us before last year. So all of those things, though, they sound so great. So how can we get parents to realize that these are not, like, why do people buy it just because it sounds good? I mean, I get it. It sounds good, but what can we do there?
Several things here, Missy, and I think one of the obvious ones is what we were talking about earlier. The people coming up with these things have a lot of letters after their name. And so, who are you to question the person with 4 PhDs? Like, obviously they know what they're talking about. And I'm just a dumb mom. I'm just a dumb dad. What in the world do I know about how to educate my children, or when I should introduce them to topics of sexuality? And so we have to break that really silly notion that just because somebody has a lot of letters, they're somehow experts and they know better than we do. Just because you have a lot of letters after your name doesn't mean that you get to sexualize my child. Doesn't mean that you get to introduce them to very, very dangerous and subversive concepts. It's absolutely flabbergasting. And I think there's a very easy way to address this. And I would encourage parents to just, the Bible gives us a really important truism. By their fruit, or by its fruit, ye shall know them, or ye shall know. So what is the fruit of this? What has been the fruit of all these experts with all these letters after their name, basically molding the hearts and minds of our children for now going on over a century, getting worse with every passing generation? Well, the fruit is all around us, right? Is America now a better society or a worse society than it was 50 years ago? Right? You go back and you look at the discipline problems they had 50, 60 years ago, chewing gum in the classroom. Maybe the kids were, being shoving each other, pushing or whatever. Now you've got kids coming to school with heroin. You've got kids shooting each other. You've got kids killing themselves. I mean, look at the CDC data. 40% of our young people, according to their own survey, report persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness. 20% are seriously plotting to kill themselves. 10% just in the last year tried to kill themselves. That's the CDC data. California, Blue Shield of California just released a poll a few months ago where they found 94% of the youth in California are reporting mental health challenges. Go back to 1950. Go back to 1940. How many school shootings did we have? How many young people did we have killing themselves? How many young people did we have who didn't know what bathroom to go in, who wanted to be castrated, who wanted to identify as a cat and pee in a litter box? Right? The fruit is so obvious. Even on the academic side, look at the government's own numbers. They show, this is the federal government's own numbers. Every 2 years, they do the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Their data, don't worry about me. Forget Alex Newman. Their data show that less than 1 in 3 of the victims of these institutions are even proficient in any of the core subjects. That's the federal government's data. So if the fruit is our kids can't read, they can't write, they can't tell right from wrong, they're incredibly depressed, they don't know what bathroom to go into, they're taking drugs, if that's the fruit of the system, how can we not recognize that regardless of how many letters the bozos who came up with this have behind their name, it's wrong. So it should just be really intuitive. And, I know moms and dads love their children. I know moms and dads want their children to be well educated. And you're right. Most of the teachers in the system want that too. And you know what? I praise God, Missy, for the teachers who see this. There are so many and this drives the politicians crazy. There are so many renegade teachers in the system who know that the way that they're required to teach reading doesn't work. And so they teach the proper way. There are so many good teachers out there who know that the history book is full of lies. And so they teach the truth. And I'm very, very grateful for them. But the system is like a straitjacket. It's closing in. And unless and until moms and dads and teachers and even students, I'm not a big promoter of student activism like the teachers unions are, but even students, when you're being lied to in class, there's a time and a place to respectfully push back and say, no, America is not an inherently evil, white supremacist, oppressive society. So we all need to push back on this together. We need to disabuse ourselves of the false notion that just because somebody got an education degree, they know what they're talking about. And we just need to get back to common sense and what our forefathers understood. This is what's so crazy, Missy. There was a time in this country not that long ago where we had essentially universal literacy. Right? If you go back to before the government took over education, endless data on this. Almost every American could read. Men, women, poor people, children, almost everybody could read. Almost everybody. I mean, Alexis de Tocqueville talks about this in the 1830s when he comes here from France. He's astounded at how educated Americans are. We didn't have government schools back then. And he says, hey, they all know their history, their constitution, the doctrines and evidences of their religion. He says a man imperfectly acquainted with all this is kind of a phenomenon, right? And today it's just the opposite. So how did that happen? Well, we've been misled, we've been lied to, we've been duped, and it's way past time for people to start pushing back on this.
So I love that you're saying we need to push back. What I'm curious about is, like, how do free societies stay free if our next generation is trained to trust these institutions? Because we trust institutions and people with lots of letters behind their name more than our own parents and our intuition and our common sense. Or you might argue that common sense, what constitutes common sense, has shifted quite a bit. And so how do we actually stay free, though? Because you say we need to push back, but I feel like a lot of people are either afraid to push back, they don't care enough to push back, they don't realize it, and if you talk to them at all, they'd rather just scroll on social media. So what do we do? Sorry, I keep asking you that, but
No,
I feel
it's
like
just
it's a
such a good
follow-up.
question. It's maybe the most important question. And I want to be fair here. I understand why people are scared to get involved. The Biden DOJ was treating parents who spoke out too vociferously as potential terrorists, right? The Soviet Poverty Law Center, which, praise the Lord, just got indicted a few weeks ago. Thank God for that. They called groups like Moms for Liberty a hate group. Like, nobody wants to be called a hate group. Nobody wants to be investigated by the Department of Justice. Nobody wants the FBI to show up at their doorstep and terrorize you about your comments at the school board. And so a lot of moms and dads say, whoa, I love my kids, but I'm not trying to go to jail. I'm not trying to get labeled a hater. So I understand why people are scared to do this. And I don't think fear is actually a good motivator. So I would say I'd like to terrorize you even more by telling you what's going to happen if you don't do something about this. You're going to lose your kids. You're going to lose your country. You're going to lose your freedom. All the stuff you value is going to be gone. But I don't want you to act out of fear. I want you to act out of love. If you love your children, you're going to take this threat very seriously. And the love is going to conquer the fear. So we love our kids so much that we're willing to risk being called bad names by the local fake newspaper. We love our kids so much that we're willing to risk being targeted by some crazy rogue Democrat prosecutor at the state or even the federal level, if that, God forbid, were to happen again. We love our children so much that we're willing to make the sacrifice to make sure they can get a good education. Our founding fathers were very clear about how we preserve our liberty. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. If we think we're just going to be lazy and ignorant and cowardly and somehow our freedom's just magically going to stay in place, we're fooling ourselves. It's utter foolishness. The norm throughout human history has been tyranny, has been slavery, has been oppression, has been misery. America is the exception to the rule. And it took a lot of hard work, a lot of sacrifice, a lot of courage and bravery by a lot of moms and dads, a lot of homeschool dads with guns, right? 4th of July coming up, 250th anniversary, celebrate homeschool dads with guns. And we need to remember that freedom's not going to protect itself. That old cliche, freedom isn't free. I think it gets abused sometimes, but it's absolutely true. So Psalm 78, I've preached whole sermons out of this. It actually tells him it's directed to ancient Israel, the ancient Hebrews, but the principles all apply. If parents don't pass on these values to the next generation, terrible things are going to happen. Go read Psalm 78 and you'll see what I mean. Terrible things are going to happen. So we need moms to be active. We need dads to be active. I personally say if you in any way can stretch and make it work to get your children out of the system, put them in a good private school, put them in a good Christian school. My wife and I, we've got 6. We homeschool. We use classical conversations and a variety of other resources. There's great ways to do incredible things. But we're going to have to make the sacrifice. It's going to be costly. And hopefully it's just money. Our founding fathers, they put their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the line. Praise the Lord, it hasn't come to that. Hopefully it won't again. But there's going to be a sacrifice. It's going to cost money. It's going to take time. And, we can't just say, well, I'm going to protect my own children and everything's going to be fine. Do we love our neighbor enough to say, hey, your children are being negatively impacted? So, I'm going to tell you about this. And I'm also going to go to the school board meeting. And I'm also going to run for school board. And I'm also going to run for state legislature. And if I can't run for state legislature, I'm also going to support a good candidate who's going to run for state legislature, who's going to stop some of this madness before it goes too far.
I think that's really important. Focusing on the positive there and that we love our kids. And truly, I want to encourage parents too, because it's not just this idea. There is this concept that's pushed that it's such a cost in that you're going to miss out on so many things. But what's not talked about is all the amazing memories and the incredible connections that you're going to make with your children when you're doing those things. Like, you know what? You can only go to so many restaurants in so many places that after a while, it's still just another restaurant. It's not that exciting as opposed to going on vacation with your kids. And if you're homeschooling and you can go anywhere, being able to learn things in person and explore civics and history and real life. And there's just so much good to it that, sure, there may be a cost that you don't get to do XYZ, but you will have some incredible rewards that you wouldn't have if you are, putting your kids through public school, quite frankly. And I did raise all of my kids went to public school, frankly, because I was not aware I thought school was still like when I was a kid. I was absolutely one of those moms. But we were also very involved in speaking with our children. So I'm happy to say that they have generally maintained an understanding, a patriotic view. They're Christians as well, but it was not through lack of very uncomfortable conversations sometimes, but just being truthful. So it's really important for parents to stay involved. There, you mentioned collectivism a bit ago, and so where some people I think may not realize is that we're seeing a shift towards this globally. So collectivist mentality is more of a, I see really truly like a global thing we're seeing overall. I mean, wasn't it the WEF that said you're going to own nothing and love it, which I don't even want to touch that for a second, but like,
Right.
it's just crazy. So with
Hmm.
that, can you help parents understand why? Because it, again, a lot of the language sounds really good of, oh, we live in an international society and all these things and being a global citizen. So why should parents be concerned when they're hearing that language, and maybe what should they be on the lookout for?
Yeah, thank you, Busy. This is a really good, important topic to be talking about. And I have some expertise here because I grew up around the world. I left the United States as a very young child, and I went to international schools in Latin America, Europe. I grew up in Africa, all over the world. And so, if there is a global citizen in that sense, it'd be me. I grew up in 8 countries and 4 continents, and I grew up with every kind of person, child you could imagine, with Jews and Hindus and Muslims and every kind of person you could imagine. And there is value in understanding the world. I think it's important for parents to teach their children about the world. And going back to the things that sound nice, the evildoers recognize that, so they market terrible ideas with nice terms. And in fact, many times they spend millions of our tax dollars doing focus groups and market research to find out what will sound nice, what will sound unthreatening. And oh, global citizen, that doesn't sound so threatening. Well, let's use that. But what we need to recognize here is that there is a global agenda. It's not limited to the United States of America. And if you go back far enough, like back in the late 1940s, early 1950s, Congress created 2 select committees to investigate what these tax exempt foundations were doing, the Reese Committee and the Cox Committee. And what they found was that Rockefeller, Carnegie, all these guys had a global agenda. They defined the ideology that was being pushed as oligarchical collectivism, right? A collectivist society ruled by an oligarch, with them being this is in a congressional report, right? And that is the agenda. They want a global system where power flows from the individual to the national government and ultimately to international authorities. And we're watching this. I mean, Trump has thrown a massive monkey wrench in this. So, whatever you think about all of Trump's policies, nobody can deny that he has really put the globalists on defense. He's withdrawn from dozens of UN agencies and things like this. But there is an agenda to empower international institutions like the World Economic Forum, like the United Nations, to play an ever greater role in the lives of people all over the world. And the education system is one of those key areas. In fact, the UN has its own education agency called UNESCO. Thankfully, Trump withdrew us from that. I praise the Lord for that. But he did that during his first term too. And one of the first things Biden did was start the process to get us back in. So we're not out of the woods yet, ladies and gentlemen. But there is this agenda to convince children that their loyalty should not be to their family. Their loyalty should not be to their country. Their loyalty should be to these international institutions, the UN, the World Economic Forum, the Bank for International Settlements, the World Bank. And they've made a lot of progress on that. If you read their own documents, they openly say that this is where this is going. You read the chapter 36 of Agenda 21 that includes education. They openly say that education is critical to transforming the attitudes, values, and beliefs of your children. It's got to include spirituality education, which that should be a red flag right there to all of us. You look at the Agenda 2030, right? This goal number 4 deals exclusively with education. This, by the way, is the document that the head of the UN General Assembly called the Master Plan for Humanity. In goal number 4, it says that your children are going to be so educated that they won't just accept or submit to these ideas, whether it's sustainable development, global citizenship is literally one of the agenda items. It says they will promote it. So that's how intense they expect this brainwashing to be. And we need to recognize that even though the United Nations uses language that we recognize, uses language that sounds good, it does not share the fundamental precepts that we all used to share, at least in America, as fundamental. The idea that God gave us rights, not government. The idea that government exists to protect our rights, right? The best thing you could say about the UN is that it's a dictators club. It's made up by largely savage dictatorships, mass murderers, gangsters, and then some kleptocracies, and a handful of somewhat liberty-minded nations. We should not want our children to put their loyalty with an institution like that. We have a great constitution. We had an incredible Declaration of Independence. We're about to celebrate the 250th birthday of that incredible document. And the idea that we would fritter all this away for global citizenship is appalling. And we know that, but our children don't. They're spending all day stewing in these ideas. It's in their textbooks. It's in their entertainment. It's on their little social media. When they're on TikTok, they're watching the glories of global citizenship. So we need to be very aware that this is happening, that it's an agenda, and that we as parents have an obligation to protect our children from this and really to explain to them the truth, that our country is special, that we've got a great Declaration of Independence, that our forefathers sacrificed, in some cases, everything so that we could live free today, so that they understand we must never surrender those things.
Yep, it is. It's a constant fight. It really is, and we have to keep working. We have to be willing to push back. Thank you for clarifying those pieces, because that I did not realize personally how much of the UN and UNESCO was infiltrating already into our schools, and it was surprising. Let's just put it that way. So I want to shift real quick to some of the biggest things in parental rights and education in particular that are top of mind for a lot of our members, which is AI in education. And you've been writing a lot about this lately. So I know we don't have a ton of time left, but what would you say are some of the biggest threats that AI raises, I guess, for parents and families?
Yeah, that's such a good question. It's such a huge question. I hope we'll get to talk about it more at the upcoming event in San Diego, because this is so critical, folks. This technology is maybe the most transformative and significant development as far as technology goes in the history of humanity. And I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that. I think this is going to transform every industry. It's going to transform every area of life. And so we can't hide from it. Clearly, it is emerging. It is here. It is improving more rapidly than I think any of us can even understand. And that's not going away. I mean, it's not. It's here to stay. And so I think we need our children to have a good understanding of technology. I'm not a Luddite by any stretch of the term. I teach my own children technology. I've got a son who programs and builds computers. It's fantastic. We need more capable young people who love God, who love country, to understand these technologies, instead of just allowing the folks in Silicon Valley, who largely secular, anti-American. We need good people to understand these technologies. But what I'm concerned about with the invasion of AI into classrooms across the country and really around the world is that these are tools that unfortunately are being used to manipulate our children, to surveil our children, and ultimately to transform the minds and the values and the attitudes of our children. And I'm not speculating about that. I've read the documents where they're talking about these things. In 2019, to go back to the UN for a moment, they hosted a conference in China, of all places, which is pioneering a lot of this evil, called AI in Education. They came up with the Beijing Declaration on AI in Education, and people should read it. It's about how every classroom in every country needs to be saturated with AI, and how these technologies need to be used to capture the data on the children, and then ultimately to change their attitudes, values, principles, and beliefs. And they say this openly over and over and over again. So what's happening with this, and again, it's coming in under terms that sound nice: personalized learning. Who could be against personalized learning, right? My child learns at his own pace. He's unique like a flower. Okay, fine. It sounds nice, but it's not. What's happening here is, if you read their documents, again, you can see this. So they talk about now the affective domain, right? Typically, when we talked about competencies, we talked about the child knows his multiplication tables. The child can read a text and summarize it. That's a competency. Under this new vision, where we're dealing with the affective domain, we're talking about values, attitudes, mindsets. What does the child believe about homosexual marriage, or borders, or government-run healthcare, or pick your issue. It doesn't even matter what side of the issue you're on. Is it the government's place to be using powerful technologies to instill new values and ideas into the hearts and minds of our children? And I think any sensible person would say generally, no, that's not the government's job. But that is what's happening. So they're putting these bizarre situations, scenarios, exercises in front of children on their little devices. The children are responding. And, back in 2012, the federal government had a very bizarre report where they were talking about some of the precursor technologies to this. They talk about facial expression cameras that would monitor the facial expression of a child. And these were already in use in 2012. Capture all that data, determine what it meant, feed it through an algorithm, and then determine what the child's response to a given stimulus was. So you can imagine, they put, an open border, or, an abortion question, or homosexual issues on the screen. And if your child has the wrong attitude, these technologies will be able to detect that, process it through the algorithm, and then determine what needs to happen. What do we need to expose this child to until he has the correct value or attitude? So the potential danger of this is hard to overstate. Again, I think children need to know about AI. I think they need to understand AI, but we need to have some serious guardrails here. We should never allow these companies in bed with big government to steal all this data on our children. We should never allow these companies to determine what values and attitudes our children are going to come out with. But that's what's happening. It is essentially a highly sophisticated form of behavioral conditioning based on a lot of the behavioral psychology going back to Pavlov and Vygotsky and B.F. Skinner. I mean, really wild individuals who viewed the human being as kind of like a more advanced circus animal. And so now they've taken this training of our children. I would even call it conditioning of our children to a whole new level. And it is becoming so effective. And we've all seen this, right? The child that hears the name Trump and, instead of foaming or drooling at the mouth like Pavlov's dogs, fascist! You can't reason. You can't provide evidence. It's because they've been conditioned to believe this. And AI is going to make this process so effective. It is a grave, grave danger. So folks, pay attention. There's so much more we could say, but this is a major issue. It's a defining issue. We've got to get it right.
That is so true. And we are going to talk about that more. I so appreciate you articulating that. I know you're right at the end. So is there any final message of hope that you can either give to parents, or what would be the key thing that you would want them to remember about preserving parental rights and the importance of parental rights?
There's a lot to be hopeful about. I mean, we're seeing, I think, an unprecedented awakening, at least in the modern era, where parents are realizing that this is not okay, that their children are in danger. They're fleeing the system by the millions since COVID. I think, all this talk of people trusting in experts and institutions. I mean, what a devastating blow COVID was to that, right? Suddenly people were like, whoa, just because he's got a white lab coat doesn't necessarily mean he knows what he's talking about. So there's a lot to be encouraged about. I mean, groups like Moms for Liberty that are attracting so much support. We should really be encouraged by all this. Again, our country's not going to save itself. Our freedoms aren't going to save themselves, but really good things are happening. We have a historic opportunity now with the kind of setup we have in government. We have a historic opportunity with this mass awakening that we're seeing. So let's not waste it. I would encourage people to get informed on these issues, and I would encourage people to get more active. Whatever you're doing, if it's good, do more of it. And together, we're going to protect our children, we're going to save our freedoms, and we're going to save our country.
I agree. Well, that is a perfect way to end. Thank you so much, Alex. We have so appreciated having you here.
Thank you, Missy. Really appreciate it.
I know I always say these are great conversations, but what a great conversation today. What Alex made clear is that parental rights aren't a side topic. They are a frontline issue in the fight to defend freedom. Because if parents lose their role as the primary authority in their children's lives, then everything else in a free society starts to unravel. Education, culture, faith, and ultimately self-government as well. The good news is that parents are waking up. We're asking better questions and refusing to be silent anymore. And that matters, because when moms and dads stand up, the entire freedom movement gets stronger. So parents, take hope. We are not powerless. Even in a confusing culture, families can still lead with clarity, courage, and purpose. And if you are looking to do this with other people as well and not be in the fight alone, head over to momsforliberty.org to find your local chapter, or consider starting one yourself. If you found this episode helpful or informative, please hit like and subscribe, and then share with a friend, so that we'll all be more educated and equipped on these issues and important topics as we become engaged citizens, not enraged activists. As James Madison said, the advancement and diffusion of knowledge is the only true guardian of liberty, which is, of course, the mission of M4L Academy. Class dismissed.